I guess we would ask you all to suspend disbelief for a moment and assume that we're living in a world of enlightened procurement, because we could whine for hours about unenlightened procurement. I would also ask you to kind of call upon the knowledge that we've gotten all day about how to deconstruct some of these arguments. You know, we heard from Darren and from Dana, how to deconstruct all these things to be able to have better conversations. So if knowledge is the root of all power, then bad benchmarks are the root of all evil. And we're going to start the conversation out today by looking at what are some of the inappropriate benchmarks that are out there, and maybe how we could introduce a new vocabulary to describe ourselves better. I'm going to start with Brian, because Brian has a very sensible approach to this whole thing, which is to kind of accept the fact that benchmarks exist and then kind of take it from there. So Brian, let's have you start with this.
I've never heard of a procurement person who didn't have their own benchmarks to bring to fore. I've also never had, personally, a benchmark that was actually above one of mine. They've always been below. So, you know, we have procurement coming to us talking about transparency and clarity and asking for support for all our numbers. Yet, if we ask back and say, okay, where do you get your benchmarks from? There's this mysterious black box or database that they all have. But because procurement is a fact of life, essentially, we really do need to deal with them. So I think I heard it in the last group, basically. Ask them a lot of questions. Ask them what their benchmarks represent. Is it geographical? Is it by medium? How do they derive the benchmarks? Particularly if it's for some type of salary benchmark, or if it's for overhead benchmark. Is it a member of one of the large holding companies? Is it a small local regional agency? So speak to them about that. Once you've done that, though, try to direct the conversation elsewhere in terms of value, which we've heard earlier on quite a bit today, and talk about the value that you can bring. And you can identify things early on rather than waiting until some of the work that you've done is on air and you can prove it to them, whether it's bundling of productions or things like that. There's quick wins or quick hits that you can identify immediately to try to pique their interest a little bit, to get them away from the cost conversation and into the value conversation. Because again, as we said before, procurement is really focused on one component of the P&L. They're on the expense component, whereas we try to drive sales and drive revenue. And that's where we really need to take the conversation.
Good. So Jim, when you and I were talking on the phone, you were sharing with me the question that came up at the very beginning is what are clients really buying? You know, there's what we're selling and then there's what they're buying. And you kind of intimated that they really want to know a few things. They want us to prove a few things, and that we could really do better by going back to the scope of work and proving some things. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, sure. I mean, we could do such a better job in terms of scope of work. You know, you think about, you know, recently had my basement redone, and we bring in a contractor, and you get one bid that's just a fixed price, and you get another bid, and this contractor's got, you know, they've got their shit together, they've given you all the detail, everything they're going to do to the basement, and you start to say to yourself, you know, I feel a little bit more comfortable about this purchase. And I think with scope of work, I mean, that is our opportunity. That is a value document. That's something where if we're selling ourselves, if that is part of what, I mean, yes, we want to have outcomes and value, I get that, but the scope of work is what the value is all about. They're seeing it. They're seeing what you're actually doing. And I think, you know, the conversations that I've had with clients where the scope of work is, you know, is well done, is detailed. And when I say detailed, I'm talking more about a scientific scope of work. I'm talking really getting into how we calculate, how do clients, you can give them a scope of work and have, you know, 50 FTEs against the responsibility, right? How do you know that's right? And that's something where as an industry, I think, we can be sharing, we can be getting this data together so that we really understand what it takes to actually do some of these tasks. So we have labor benchmarks. I mean, I feel like the craziest thing about the benchmark conversation, besides the fact that I'm sitting on a benchmark panel, I was telling my son, I was benchmarks, like, what's that? I'm like, I don't know how I got on a benchmark panel. But I mean, it's about, as an industry, us coming together. I mean, our clients have all the information. They have all the RFPs, they get all these different requests for data, and we give it to them. And we give it to all the consultants. And then they create benchmarks. And we're sitting here having this nice meeting when we have all the data. We could be doing this on our own and having an opinion on this. So I think scope of work is really, really important. And it's also, I think it's a fun conversation to have with procurement because let them push back on something like scope of work. It's a lot better than overhead.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Allie, when you and I were talking on the phone, you had this really wonderful line. You said, telling is not sharing, and that a lot of times these consultants will sit down and tell you that they have benchmarks and yet refer to share what these benchmarks are. So talk a little bit about transparency. We're probably a little ways away from having baseball cards of each campaign that have the FTEs on them and stuff, but talk about transparency and where that could go.
Well, I think John Seifert touched on it today. It's about trust. And the fact is, most of the procurement discussions we've had tend to be that from the procurement side, we are telling you what our benchmark is, and you need to be more transparent. In my experience, we've actually walked out of discussions when that's the approach they've taken. We've just said we're not going to accept that. When you think about it, just from a methodology standpoint, you could have so many different ways of developing these benchmarks. In any negotiation that I've been where we haven't had that sort of reciprocal transparency, we have not accepted those benchmarks, and we've taken the discussion away from it. You have to have that reciprocal transparency. We've talked about just the methodology. We've talked about billing rates, just hourly rates. If you use different annual number of hours, you get a completely different number. And I have to say that I don't think our cost structures in all of the agencies over here differ that much. So when you get a benchmark from a procurement client, from a procurement guy who actually says that you're 50% off the benchmark, we're not talking about the same thing. We're just not talking about the same thing. So at that point, you can't actually continue that discussion unless you get an understanding of how he's actually calculated that. For the last 5 years, I've been sort of having hand-to-hand battled in multiple markets with actually the same procurement guy, and he brings the same benchmarks everywhere. And either he's a glutton for punishment or I am. But either way, we've just stopped. I think the first meeting I had with this individual, I walked out of the meeting and I said, I'm not doing this anymore. And that was it. It set the tone. And he never brought up those benchmarks without actually sharing them with. One of the things that I actually encourage procurement guys to do is help us. We'll give you the data if you let us help you develop the benchmarks. Let us be a part of that process rather than it just being, this is it, we're going to shove this down your throat. That's really been our approach about it. We do not want this to be one-way traffic. We will help, but if you're way off, we are definitely not talking about the right things.
Good. So we've heard a lot of discussion today about the various different benchmarks, people who use index against a media spend, value as a means of performance criteria, agency utilization rates and overhead factors. My favorite is working versus non-working dollars. I don't know what that means. Let's just go down the line. What are your favorite inappropriate benchmarks? The ones that you just kind of like make a bet on the side that how soon it's going to come up?
I have to say it's probably the working versus non-working. Because it just, depending upon the work that you're doing, whether you have media in or out, whether you're doing digital or interactive media, there's just no benchmarks. And benchmarks work if you have an automotive assembly plant and you figure out how many cars are going to roll off the line in a given hour. But in an industry like ours, where there's just so much variability, the benchmarks really, they don't translate unless you have a very good understanding, a keen understanding of how things are developed. Whoops.
Yeah, I would have to, a similar one is effective rates or index. I just think you walk into a client negotiation and they're saying, well, you know what, I think it should be about 6%. And you're saying, did you look at my scope of work? Do you have any idea what it is that I'm going to be doing for you? How do you come up with 6%? How many campaigns is that going to be? It's just such an ignorant, it's hard to get non-emotional, and because you're just like, are you stupid? Do you not get that? I kid. No, you don't.
Well, I mean, the working versus non-working dollars is one that really gets under my skin, because it implies that what we as a creative agency do is non-working. Now, I don't know about you guys. I'm not working. The overheads one, I mean, I think, Rick, you touched upon it. I mean, I think the benchmarks around overhead are really bogus. They don't mean anything. It's funny, I'm just about to go down the list of all the benchmarks I've been through as inappropriate. The other one, and Laurie, you and I talked about it on the phone, we had a similar situation with a procurement client in Europe who was using specific deliverable-based benchmarks. So he was saying, well, this is the number of hours it takes to do this. And he was using a benchmark that he had clearly derived from a very mature advertising market that had clearly been established as an advertising market. And he was applying it in a negotiation that I was having in Accra, Ghana. And I was like, this doesn't even compute. You could not be using these. So they sort of universally apply the same. It's like that one-size-fits-all sort of approach to it, and it doesn't work. So, I mean, it comes back to the same thing of, how have you built these benchmarks? Where's the data derived from? And are you really comparing it on an apples-to-apples basis?
Yeah. So I think one of the, go ahead.
Just a quick one on that. Has to do with like either blended salary rates or blended cost per FTE. For example, a number of years ago, we had a client that was an investment bank. And in order to do that, you need some very senior creative people who have some experience with investment accounts and retirement accounts and things like that. And they came back to us and said that our blended hourly rate per FTE was much, much higher, 50% higher basically than their benchmarks. And you had to sit down with them and explain to them that you can't have somebody right out of school who basically is living paycheck to paycheck or still living in their parents' cellar developing creative for a product like this. You need a seasoned creative director to do this. And that's why, again, it gets back to understanding where their benchmarks came from and explaining, because on the surface, benchmarks just don't work. And unless you dig into them, they really have no worth to them at all.
Yeah, really, really good. Good point. So part of changing the conversation is getting some new vocabulary. So we've just heard about how you can deconstruct, how you can have the conversation not be about their benchmarks, but understanding how they got to their benchmarks and replacing it with new ones. But in starting a new conversation, which is all about what the client is buying and starting to talk in their language, value, compensation, what are some of the articulations that maybe you guys have created that are a new way of describing the value that an agency actually brings? New benchmarks or things that you benchmark yourself that are important?
Ooh.
You can pass.
When we talk about performance-based, I think there's kind of, I guess, enlightened performance-based where it's much more about metrics that you're truly controlling. And then there's regular performance-based where it's metrics that are like, sales, where there are a lot of things that could go wrong, you're in it all together, and you have more of the business side metrics and an evaluation. I think what we're trying to really do is really create a performance framework, and that's really the kind of vocabulary that you bring to clients is how do you get a performance-based metric that really means something that you're truly controlling. And it's not something you do overnight. It's not something, you have a pitch and you decide, I'm just going to throw out a performance-based system. I mean, you can do that. But to create a true system, you need to test it, you need to get your analytics people in there, you need to really look at what's important to their business, and you got to test it, you got to get confidence in it, and then when you've done all that, then you can start talking about tying that to compensation and putting together a really smart performance system. I think all too often clients want performance-based and they don't really think about what's involved in truly creating something that's going to make sense to the agency. Because we talked about earlier, you want this to be something that motivates the agency. You want it to be something that's real. And to have a target that's just some sales target that you don't control, while it's fine to have it as a third or some small portion, but to have a real commanding performance-based system that you're controlling, you want the metrics to be good. So.
Ollie, you have anything to add?
Well, what he said. No, actually, I don't think we as an industry, I think, or our, even our clients have necessarily sort of figured out how to articulate value. I think it's still pretty subjective. So I don't think we're necessarily there with value-based compensation. And I know it's become the buzzword in our industry now, but the fact is I think we are sort of evolving towards that. And performance-based compensation is where we would go first. And we, with the panel earlier on, we got a sense that we're still not even there yet. There's still a lot of learning there that we need to go through. But value, I mean, it's a tough one right now. But I think performance-based, when you have the right criteria, and as you touched upon earlier, when it is based on the right metrics, not procurement's metrics, but more so to do with what marketing and what your client's business objectives are. I think that's an easier sell from a value standpoint rather than this sort of subjective. I had an example that I had mentioned to you on the phone when we had a client who was trying to implement value-based compensation, and we did some work that we were repeating the next year. And the first year we did it cost us 10,000 euros, I think. And the next year he said, this year I value this at only 2,000 euros. I want you to do it for 2,000. That's my value on this. Again, we walked out. We said, just give it to a mom and pop shop or give it to somebody else, give it to a local provider. We're not going to be doing this. So I just think that it's still a tricky subject. I don't think we've necessarily mastered it yet. And we are evolving to that. We are moving out of labor-based and potentially moving into more performance-based compensation. But value is still a tricky subject to really crack right now.
Jim, do you like that? Brian, okay. So we're going to open it up for questions, and we're going to come back in a second after questions, and I'm going to ask each one of the panelists, do they think there's anything that we should standardize ourselves at the 4A's as far as a benchmark that would help us walking into some conversations? But in the meantime, what have we got as far as questions go? Yeah, in the back.
There's been a lot of talk today about scope of work, talking about standardization, and people talking about that detailed scope of work. Do you have the same scope of work for all of your clients? Is that standardized within your agencies? It seems to me like that's a potential other trap for us to get into if we start, is part of the scope of work that I gave you this thought leadership piece that we would have spent $2 million giving that to McKinsey gave it to you, but you're paying me an hourly wage. I mean,
I mean, to answer your question, I mean, it should be. I mean, scope of work should be something. The approach should be something that's standard throughout the agency. Every account, whether the scope of work that you create is something that goes in the contract with that client, depending on how that client works, internally, you should have the same approach to scope of work on every single client. And that's something which, granted, in these huge networks, it's just not implemented yet. You'd like to see it that way. I know that Mike brought up Farmer account. There are some clients that we have where we use Farmer, and it's a very detailed scope of work. It looks great. I can't say that every single scope of work is exactly the way it should be. I know that in terms of anyone who's in a position like my position or financial position within a company, I feel like has got to press scope of work. It should be standard. It's standard operating procedure. So, and then I think once you create that, I think it's how do you take that document and start to derive benchmarks from it. So using that document to help price for other clients, so you have a database, and then taking it one step further, how do we as an industry take those benchmarks and create something that truly then lets us look at how we're actually scoping for projects and are we doing it in an efficient way, et cetera.
Yeah, very good. I mean, one of the things that he shared with me when we were talking offline was, he said, I think the guys that write scope of work are should be rock stars. They should be people who really understand the ins and outs of how you make money and more money out of a properly articulated scope of work. So that's not to say that having a standardized approach to scope of work would mean a consulting gig would look the same as a production gig. It means that you have people inside your company that actually know how to articulate the very detailed micro, management of that project in a way in which, if the client change it, bring it on. We make more money. So that's kind of.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to add a quick comment on that about, the more detailed a scope of work you can do, the more you can identify the more valuable pieces of what you do. So you were talking about, a thought piece that McKinsey might do. Well, that inherently should have much more value than executing a print ad through your production. And the more you can define those things that you do of that ilk, the much better off you'll be probably in negotiating the fees with your clients.
And just one other thing, and I'm so glad you remembered that. But scope of work, and you're completely right. It's an approach, but it is a skill. And you know what? There are people that are better at writing scopes of work than others, and we've got a lot of account people that think they're really good at writing scopes of work, and they're not. And it's not something. I really think it's one of these things where you talk about having deal teams. You definitely should have people throughout the agency that supervise and write the scopes of work and ask all the right questions, just the way a consultant would, because it is such a specialized skill and it is so important.
Well, I mean, the only thing that I'd add is, at this point, yes, it is a bit client-driven. We don't have that discipline necessarily consistently applied across the agency. But it's not just about the development of a scope of work, it's about managing to that scope of work. And I think that discipline doesn't necessarily exist yet either. So we'll put a scope of work, we'll put it in the contract, and that's it. It's gone into a file now. And at the end of the year, you realize that you've screwed the profitability on that business because you had scope creep throughout the year. So it has to be about the entire process. And one of the things that I'm encouraging a lot of our offices to do now is actually to, even if a client's not giving you a scope of work, let's just keep track of things so that we can have that more educated conversation at the end of the year so that we don't fall into the same trap in the next year.
Very good. I mean, one of the things we talked about was having our own benchmarks to kind of come up against these consultants. I had the luxury of doing an interview once with McKinsey, and they can go back to 1957 and tell you exactly what happened on every single project they did, how much revenue they made, how much resources they played. Again, they have benchmarks up the wazoo. So a good place to start would be with your current clients, your current scopes of work, and regular reviews to know what it takes to do certain things. So when you get a guy that shows up and said, I only valued this at 2,000, you can say, well, I happen to know we won't do it for that. So you can, thank you very much and goodbye. So good thinking. Question.
I haven't really worked with pharma that much, so they haven't done very much in media. But, and I've seen their detailed scope that they do. Do they have sort of guidelines on the different steps of the different items in the scope and about how much time each thing should take? Or?
I mean, they do. I mean, we've used it with clients, and we had a good result. But where the clients took an issue was with the fact that it is a little bit black box. There is a little bit more of their algorithm that they use in terms of how they're calculating it. And what I would like to do, and I like their template. It's very simple. It's very intuitive. There's nothing in it that you wouldn't put in yourself. And then they have a track mechanism, which, again, these are all things that we should all have and we should do, and you could do it on Excel if you really wanted to. But I think we need to kind of get into that black box, and so we understand exactly what those deliverables really are. What are the hours that go into it? What's driving that? Once you can start to dispel that in a really simplistic way, because that's the other thing we talk about with the overhead conversations. These conversations, the more complex they get, they don't travel up very well. A CEO has, once it goes up the levels, there's only so much complexity they can deal with. So it's how do you take these conversations and make them simple enough so that it gets the message across, it's clear, yet you're still making them feel comfortable with the scope of work.
Another question. Yes.
Are you finding that procurement people are playing the same games with more new media, like mobile, gaming, social, where there isn't as much of that established data back to 1957, say? Or are you finding that we have a little bit more flexibility in talking more about value, or at least providing our own benchmarks?
Yeah. I've found that there is a learning curve, similar to when they first came into the marketing arena, but I've also found that they're catching up much more quickly. So the window of, if you want to call it opportunity, really to make the margins that you think you should earn is shrinking.
Yeah, I think anytime there's new media or new discipline, there is definitely an opportunity to achieve a higher margin. I just think that's just the reality of our business. And then the more the procurement starts to get benchmarks, start to sink their teeth into it, get competitive offers, the price starts to slip.
So Ollie, if we were to do a 4A's benchmark of some sort, what could we benchmark that would help us as we walk into all these?
Well, I mean, I think Rich touched upon it as well. I think it has to be around hourly rates. It has to be around agency compensation of its employees. I mean, I think we need to get away from even trying to do benchmarks on overheads and stuff like that. I think we should just, as an industry, say, stop it. We're not going to talk about this. But it has to be about the cost of our resources. And I think what you'll see with that is that we're all pretty much aligned, because I cannot imagine one of you is paying more for talent than us, or vice versa. I think the talent is pretty consistently remunerated and compensated across the industry. I think that would be the one. And I think with the 4A's, we should have benchmarks. So if your agencies are not providing the data for these surveys, I'd really encourage you to do so, because it really is it's to benefit you and as an industry. Tom, that's my shameless plug for you.
Jim, would you add anything to that?
I think the surveys are very important, and the billing rates are important. I completely agree, steering the conversation away from overhead does make sense, despite the fact that it still comes up, and it would be nice to have something to refute it when you're dealing with unenlightened procurement. But I think one problem that we probably have is that it's not accredited. These are surveys that we're filling in, and we're providing the data, and clients get it, and it's not necessarily objective. So what I would love to see is a little bit more objectivity in our studies, because what's funny about this is we give our information to consultants who are supposed to be the ones who are objective, yet they're creating these studies that are absolutely ridiculous. So we have to find a way to create something that's more objective that we can use, and then making it simple, usable, and standardized across all the agencies. Because at the end of the day, procurement needs something to compare. If we don't give them something to compare, they're going to keep looking for things to compare, and that's why they're going to overhead. So it's got to be something standard that's easy to compare and that makes sense.
Brian, would you add anything?
Yeah, my only, parting comment basically is it all comes down to negotiations. I mean, there are those procurement people against which there is no negotiating. They basically lay down the law, and you have to decide whether you're going to walk out of the room or not. There are some enlightened ones you can have a reasonable discussion with, and in those instances, you know your numbers, you know your benchmarks, and you can have a good discussion with them. The others fall somewhere in between. So a lot of it comes down to negotiations and sizing up the person that you're doing it against. But as we've said before, as I've heard before, it's you have to go in as a team, and you really have to know what your objectives are, and you have to be aligned.
Yep. So I think to kind of summarize and wrap up what was said here, it's really all about controlling the conversation, not being separated by a common language. So deconstructing the argument to understand what somebody has made their benchmarks. If they refuse to share, you're talking to yourself in a mirror. You are not in a negotiation. Do not pretend you're in a negotiation. You are dealing with somebody who has all the cards behind their back. So knowing that, and then deciding, Ollie will give courses afterwards on how to get up and walk away. You have to have that going into into a negotiation. So really control the conversation. Understand the language being used, understand how it's being measured, deconstruct it, try to add and articulate your agency's value in that mix, and that is the beginning of not having benchmarks be the root of all evil. Thank you, you guys.
Thank you.